So my name is Sydney Lamb. I'm a senior in the BioScience program, and I've been working on this project for the last 2 school years. So starting off with a quick question, has anyone in here ever had back pain? Well, you're obviously in pretty good company. 8 out of 10 people worldwide will have back pain at some point in their lives. And most commonly, this is due to a condition called degenerative disc disease, which I will dig into a little bit later. But first, let's look at some anatomy. So here is a model of the spinal column. The 2 main parts of the spinal column are the vertebrae, which are the bone-like structures that actually form the spinal column, and then there are the intervertebral discs. So taking a closer look, here you see an intervertebral disc between 2 vertebrae. So it provides mobility as well as stability and cushioning so that the spine will actually hold up functionally and comfortably to the pressure and torque we place on it every single day. Now taking a closer look at the intervertebral disc, you can see that there are 2 layers. The annulus fibrosus, which is the outer, more fibrous layer that actually keeps the whole disc intact and helps to withstand the constant compressive forces that we place on it every day. Now, the other layer is the inner nucleus pulposus, which is a protein-based gel-like substance that helps distribute the pressure that we put on it. So, what happens in degenerative disc disease, you may ask? So looking at a normal disc, you can see that both layers are completely intact. There's no tearing, there's no damage. But looking at an unhealthy disc, you can see that there's tearing and the distortion of that outer annulus fibrosus, and this has caused the leaking out of the inner nucleus pulposus. And all of this has led to a loss of disc height. So basically, once those outer layer fibers tear, that inner nucleus pulposus starts to leak out, and that causes that disc to shrink and become kind of squished between the vertebrae. So basically that causes bone-on-bone contact between the vertebrae. So here you see is a thick and sturdy disc there at the top, and then you can see the progression into a degenerated disc where you can see that tearing of the outer layer of the annulus fibrosus, and this translates into a thinning disc, where you can start to see those vertebrae are slowly getting closer to each other. And all of this leads to the final stages of disc degeneration, where it actually starts to form osteophytes, which is a type of scar tissue formed by that bone-on-bone movement. So, now the treatments start out pretty non-invasive for this condition, usually beginning with anti-inflammatory medications such as ibuprofen and oral steroids, and then leading to chiropractic care and probably physical therapy. But after a little while, if all those don't really work out, we lead into something a little bit more invasive, like steroid injections, where they actually inject steroids into the affected area in the spine. But sometimes all of those don't work. So this leads to surgery. There are 2 options for surgery, and the first is vertebral fusion. So basically what they do is they scrape out all the inner content of that disc, all the damaged material, and they replace it with bone cement and then bolt the vertebrae that are above and below it together. This takes away the rubbing of the 2 vertebrae on one another, but it still takes away a lot of the mobility and structural components of those vertebrae and the movement allowed there. So here you can see an x-ray of exactly what this looks like in the spine. You can see all the bolts, and you can see it looks pretty nasty. So next up, the second option is disc replacement. You can see in this drawing that the original disc has been removed and replaced with a prosthetic disc. The prosthetic disc currently used consists of 2 metal end plates with basically a piece of rubber in between them to allow for some movement. So here you can see it on x-ray as well. You can see the 2 metal end plates attached to the vertebrae above and below the affected area. So unlike spinal fusion, this disc replacement does preserves some functional mobility, and it also provides some stability as well. But it does not allow for the cushioning necessary for a vertebral disc. So I decided that for such a common condition, we need a new surgical treatment for it. So that's why I decided to develop an artificial intervertebral disc replacement. So I first had to determine what the device needed to do. And this process is called specifications. And this is really the most important part of the design process. First, the device had to maintain sterility. So that means that during the process of inserting the device, there can be no microorganisms introduced. So the device must be sterile and the procedure must be conducted under sterile conditions. Next up, we have minimized trauma. In this case, we are talking about minimizing damage to tissue surrounding the affected area. So for example, it is important that we have the smallest incision possible to decrease risk of bleeding and infection. Next, and more importantly, minimize and hopefully avoid damaging any of the ligaments, tendons, and nerves that surround the spinal column. All of this will lead to a quick recovery. So moving on, a huge part of having a successful and safe biomedical device is biocompatibility. This means that finding certain materials that don't interact with the body in a negative way. The human immune system does wonders when it comes to protecting our body, but we don't want it rejecting the disc. Another specification of the disc is that it must be able to cushion the vertebrae around it and withstand the extreme amount of pressure we put on it every single day. Next, your spine is designed to have incredible mobility. It is vital that the device reinforces this ability and gives us the opportunity and ability to move. Last, in order for your spine to accomplish all of the daily activities it needs to, it has to have stability, or this will create an imbalance and it will not be able to use the functions it was designed to have. So, to accomplish all of these different specifications, I had several ideas. The first was to just insert some kind of a silicone-based gel substance using a device called a cannula, which is a thin tube inserted into the body to administer medicine or insert a surgical instrument. With this device, we would easily be able to inject this gel substance into the intervertebral disc space, but after doing some digging, I discovered that the idea had already been patented. Therefore, it felt too unoriginal. And so I started thinking, trying to find a new, more unique way to develop a disc replacement. And finally, after 2 weeks of frying my brain, trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do, I was doing my homework one night in my dorm room, and I took apart the pen I was using. And if anyone has ever done the same to their pens, you know that inside lies a spring that usually looks almost identical to this one. Now I was playing around with it, and I got an idea. If you think about it, a spring acts very similar to a spinal column. It can compress and return to its original position, it can be mobile and bend, and it also seems to have a certain degree of stability. So I thought, why not put one in a disc replacement? So after several attempts of trying to design a device, I finally settled on one. What you're looking at is a sketch of the top of a vertebra in my layout for the device. Going into further detail, the 6 smaller light blue circles you can see are all normal coil springs. A coil spring is basically your typical spring, being that it is the most commonly used kind of spring. And now looking back at the sketch, you can see the larger dark blue circle in the center, and this circle represents something called a wave spring. This kind of spring is more stable and would act as the base for the device, while the coil springs allow for the more mobile ability and would revolve more around that center spring. So now that I had the design, I needed to figure out how I was actually going to insert the device. So after doing some brainstorming, I decided to return back to part of my original idea and try to find a way to use a cannula, because why not make this idea more difficult? However, if you try to push a coiled wire through a straight cannula, you will end up with a straight wire. And that's where nitinol comes in. Nitinol is an extremely unique alloy, as it has something called memory. So no matter how much you try to bend or maneuver the wire, it will always return back to its original shape. Now the tricky part is actually shaping the wire into a new original position, which in my case would obviously be a spring. One of our biomedical device engineers, Jim Picorni, helped me to do this. So first we had to wrap the wire around a bolt and then secure each end of it. Then the nitinol wrap bolt needs to be heated to around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in this small box furnace. Simple enough, right? I know it doesn't look like much, but the oven in these pictures can actually heat up to around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So what you will see in this video is one of the nitinol springs that we shaped in the small box furnace in the lab. You will see the spring being pushed out of a straight cannula and then recoiling back into its original position. So what this shows is basically the mechanism by which the spring would be inserted into the intervertebral space. So for the next steps, the first would be to finish molding springs using the oven. Next, I would design a prototype using the springs I've molded. And lastly, I would get a patent to claim the idea as my own. Thank you so much for listening.